meant to see each one safe below ground. The horse stood just outside the cellar, reins dangling, ears. I grew up hearing the story of that storm every harvest season, as if the wheat itself remembered it. It was the summer of 1923, a dry year on the plains. My grandfather's father, Samuel again but younger by a good 15 years than during the river winter, was 28 and working as a farmhand on the Miller homestead. The day began with the kind of heat that presses the air flat against the earth. The wheat field shimmered under the noon sun, stalks whispering like restless hands. By late afternoon, the horizon to the west had turned the color of tarnished iron, and a strange yellow haze settled over the rows. Samuel was hauling water from the well when he noticed the cattle stamping and tossing their heads. He had lived long enough on the plains to trust the way animals sense the wind before men do. He went up on the porch and scanned the sky. Behind the haze, a dark wall of cloud had begun to boil upward, twisting at the top. There was no radio warning, only what you could read in the color of the clouds. He set the bucket down and called for Mr. Miller, the old farmer whose wheat field spread nearly to the riverbank. By the time the two men climbed the small ridge to get a better view, the western sky had taken on a greenish cast. Heat still clung to the ground, but the wind was shifting, cool drafts sneaking low along the wheat as if the earth itself were drawing a breath. Samuel said later it was the birds that convinced him it was no ordinary storm. Flocks lifted from the wheat and flew low toward the eastern tree line, wings beating quick and silent. Overhead, the clouds spiraled slower than a hawk, but with a weight that made the heart thump. They had a storm cellar dug behind the Miller house, just big enough for one family and maybe a pair of goats. But the neighbors' homes lay scattered across the flat like toy blocks, and none had a shelter as sturdy. "Fetch the others," Miller said, voice tight. "If that drops, they'll need the cellar too." Samuel didn't waste another word. He saddled the gray farm horse, swung a coil of rope across the saddle horn, and set out at a gallop along the wagon road that stitched the wheat field to the distant homesteads. The wind rose behind him as he rode, kicking dust devils across the road. The sky to the west looked as if it had been ripped open, showing a darker sky beneath. The wheat swayed in unison, all heads bending east. At each homestead he reined in hard, shouted over the rising wind for families to pack children, elders, and any livestock they could manage and head for Miller's storm cellar. Most didn't question him. One look at the sky was enough. Mothers bundled babies in quilts. Fathers unhitched mules still slick with sweat from plowing. By the time Samuel reached the farthest farmhouse, the first distant growl of thunder rolled low like a wagon crossing a wooden bridge. Dust and chaff lifted from the road in sheets, slapping against his coat. He turned the horse back toward the Miller place with a line of wagons and riders following in his wake. Children clutching stuffed sacks of belongings, goats bleating, a pair of milk cows driven ahead by a boy with a switch. When they crested the final rise, they saw the dark wall of cloud had lowered a funnel halfway toward the earth. A strange, thin roaring came with the wind now, distant yet rising. Samuel rode ahead to the barnyard where Miller's eldest son was throwing open the heavy cellar door. The space below smelled of damp clay and pickled jars. Families hurried down the steps one after another. The younger ones pushed ahead first. Samuel held the horse's bridle and looked back at the western sky once more before ducking inside himself. He said later it was the last calm breath he felt that evening, just before the plains wind found its voice. The first ones into the cellar were the smallest children, their eyes wide as lantern globes. Their mothers pressed them down the wooden steps with murmurs meant to sound calm. The heavy door above was still propped open to the gray sky, letting in a thin shaft of evening light. Samuel stayed by the threshold to count each head as it passed. He had ridden hard to warn every neighbor, and now he meant to see each one safe below ground. The horse stood just outside the cellar, reins dangling, ears flicking at the distant thunder. A boy of about 10 tugged at Samuel's sleeve and asked if the horse would be all right in the storm. Samuel crouched and told him gently, "He's weathered worse than this, son," though he wasn't entirely sure it was true. Still, the words steadied the boy enough to go down the steps. When the last wagon pulled into the yard, Samuel helped lift a frail grandmother from the bench seat and carried her in his arms toward the cellar. She smelled faintly of sage and fresh bread. He set her on the lowest step and guided her down. Inside, the air was thick and cool. The walls had been shored with rough timbers and shelves lined with jars of preserves that glinted in the lamplight. The floor was packed earth, slightly damp under their boots. Families pressed close together, whispering prayers. The shuffle of boots and the muffled bleats of the two goats the Millers had managed to coax inside, filling the space. The cellar could hold maybe 30 if everyone stayed close. Samuel moved through the crowd, checking for space, making sure no child was left behind. He could feel the pressure change above ground as the storm front pressed in. A low throb in his ears, like water filling a hollow log. Mr. Miller came down last, closing the heavy wooden door and sliding the iron bar across it. The outside light disappeared, replaced by the wavering glow of 2 lanterns. The muffled roar of the wind became clearer now that the door was shut, as though they had cupped their hands over their ears and pressed them against the earth to listen to the sky. Samuel felt the cellar quiver slightly as a gust slammed against the door. A few children cried out, and their mothers hushed them, rocking them in their arms. The first real blast of the tornado's voice came as a deep humming roar, not yet close but vast, like an approaching freight train still a mile down the tracks. The goat stamped nervously and a jar rattled on its shelf. Samuel moved back to the door and pressed his palm against it. It shuddered against another gust. He glanced over at Miller, who gave a silent nod. They both understood that if the door went, nothing inside would hold. Minutes dragged like hours. The roar outside swelled and dipped as the funnel shifted across the fields. Someone began to pray aloud, voice low and steady, the words blending with the rise and fall of the wind. In that dim earthen room, Samuel thought of the wheat field overhead, the rippling golden sea that had fed the families all these years, now likely flattened under the black twisting wind. He thought of the horse tethered just outside, hooves planted, probably staring at the storm with the same stubbornness that had kept it plowing straight rows through clay soil. Then the sound changed. The roar sharpened to a shriek, and the whole cellar seemed to flex as if the earth itself were bending. A sudden thump against the door made everyone jump. Just a loose branch hurled by the wind, Samuel guessed. But for a breath it felt like the storm had knocked. He tightened the bar across the door and braced his shoulder against it as the shriek passed. Dust sifted from the rafters, and the lantern flames danced wildly, throwing the family's shadows in long, trembling streaks across the walls. And then, as suddenly as it had surged, the roar began to ebb, retreating to a dull rumble. The cellar stayed quiet except for the sound of nervous breathing and a single baby hiccuping after its tears. Samuel waited another long 5 minutes with his ear to the door before daring to lift the bar. When he finally cracked it open, a heavy damp smell rushed in. Rain-soaked earth, splintered wood, and wheat stalks torn green before their time. The sky outside was still gray but no longer spinning. In the distance, the last curve of the funnel faded like smoke into the clouds, leaving a raw path across the plains. Samuel stepped out first, scanning the battered yard. The barn still stood, though part of its roof sagged inward. The wheat field to the west was matted flat as though a giant palm had pressed it down. But the farmhouse, the cellar, and every soul he had gathered within had endured. He turned back to the cellar steps and called softly, "It's safe now." The first rays of sun broke through the thinning clouds as Samuel stood in the muddy yard, boots sinking slightly into the rain-soaked earth. The sky had a strange pale light after the storm, the kind that makes broken things look sharper against the horizon. Neighbors climbed out of the cellar slowly, blinking at the gray morning. Mothers carried babies bundled in blankets that smelled of damp straw. The goats scrambled up behind them, shaking their ears free of dust. Samuel helped the frail grandmother up the last few steps and steadied her as she reached the yard. She clutched his arm for balance and whispered a thank you too soft for anyone else to hear. For a long moment, no one spoke. They were all staring at the wheat field that now lay flattened in one wide strip running from the distant ridge straight toward the cellar. It looked as if a giant had dragged a wet brush across the plains. Mr. Miller walked out beside Samuel, resting a hand on his shoulder. His face was drawn, his shirt streaked with cellar dirt, but his eyes were steady. "We'll cut the rest for feed," he said, voice low. "Better than letting it rot where it lies." Samuel nodded but kept his eyes on the path the funnel had carved. He could still hear the distant roar in his head. A small boy stepped up to Samuel holding a handful of soggy wheat heads. "Can it still grow again?" he asked. Samuel knelt to meet the boy's eyes. "Next spring it will," he said. "Wheat's got a way of coming back." They began to take stock of the damage. Fences near the west pasture had been torn away, leaving posts leaning like crooked teeth. A wagon lay on its side in the ditch, its wheels half buried in silt. One chicken coop had vanished entirely, only a scatter of feathers left behind. But the barn still stood despite its sagging roof. The farmhouse's windows had held. Most important of all, every person who had gone into the cellar was standing now in the weak sunlight. By mid-morning, the men formed a small group to check on other farms along the ridge. Samuel offered to ride ahead since his horse had stood tethered through the storm and still had strength in its legs. The road was slick and pitted with ruts where water had run wild during the night. He passed stretches of wheat flattened like fallen soldiers, patches of bare earth where the topsoil had been clawed away by the wind, and pieces of timber that had once been parts of someone's shed or gate. At the first farm down the road, he found a family already clearing debris from their porch. The father waved a tired greeting, shouting that they had all come through unharmed. The second farm had lost part of a barn wall, but no lives. By noon, Samuel had covered a wide loop and could report back that the storm had been cruel to the land but merciful to the people. Back at the Miller farm, the women had already begun salvaging what they could, setting wet blankets to dry on the fence rails and sweeping mud from the porch steps. Mr. Miller stood near the flattened wheat with his hat in his hands. "We'll plant again," he said to no one in particular, his words carrying over the field. Samuel took a long look at the cellar door, still streaked with rain and dust, but intact. The memory of the roaring wind pressing on the other side of that door felt as if it had been carved into his bones. That night, after the neighbors had returned to their own homes and the Miller children finally slept, Samuel sat alone by the barn. The horse stood beside him, chewing slowly at a patch of wet grass. Overhead, the stars came out again, bright and cold. He thought about the strip of land where the tornado had cut deepest, and he made himself a quiet promise. The next time a storm came barreling down on the plains, he would be ready sooner. He had learned the weight of minutes and how a single minute could mean the difference between loss and survival. The plains had always belonged to the wind, but that night Samuel felt as though he and the land had struck an unspoken pact. He would keep watch, and the land would rise again after the storm's fury passed. The morning after the storm's passing, the land bore a strange stillness. The birds had not yet returned to their usual chatter, and the wheat field lay in battered waves like hair combed in the wrong direction. Samuel rose before sunrise and found the Miller family already at work. Mrs. Miller had a line of damp quilts strung between two fence posts, steam rising off them in the pale light. The youngest girl was scattering grain for the few surviving hens that had come fluttering back from wherever they had hidden during the storm. Samuel tightened the cinch on his horse and began clearing branches from the road leading toward the bridge. The mule-drawn wagon needed a path to reach the next farm for supplies. By mid-morning, neighbors gathered again, this time not for fear but for work. Men carried saws and hammers, women brought baskets of bread and jars of preserves. They greeted each other with quiet nods and the kind of smiles people share when they've seen the worst together. The first task was repairing the collapsed fence along the western pasture. The posts were leaning or broken, and in some places the rails had vanished entirely. Samuel worked with two other men to reset the posts, driving them deep into the softened earth, then wiring fresh rails in place. The smell of damp wood and wet soil clung to their hands and clothes. The barn roof came next. A loose sheet of tin had curled upward during the storm and was threatening to tear off completely in the wind. Samuel climbed the ladder with a hammer in his belt and a nail pouch slung across his shoulder. The view from the roof showed the tornado's path more clearly than ever, a winding scar of flattened wheat stretching straight to the horizon. When they paused for a midday meal, sitting on the barn's south wall in the shade, the conversation was hushed but hopeful. Mr. Miller broke off a piece of cornbread and said, "We plant again as soon as the ground dries. The land's been good to us before. It will be good again." Samuel nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow with a sleeve. "The roots are still under there. The storm can't reach that deep." In the afternoon, the children pitched in, hauling fallen branches to the edge of the field where they could later be used for kindling. The goats followed them like curious shadows, nibbling on anything green that had survived the wind. As the sun began to drop, casting long amber rays over the plains, Samuel and Mr. Miller stood side by side, surveying the patched fences and the barn's newly fastened roof. They both knew the work was far from done, yet the sight of order slowly returning to the yard gave them a sense of quiet victory. At dusk, the women lit lamps in the windows again, their warm glow shining out onto the recovering field. For the first time since the storm, the sound of a fiddle floated from the farmhouse porch. One of the older boys had taken it upon himself to coax a tune from the battered instrument. Samuel leaned against the fence post he'd set earlier that day and listened to the music. The stars began to prick through the evening sky, steady and bright. He thought of the night before, of the cellar's damp air and the roar outside that had sounded like the end of the world. Then he looked at the wheat field now lying quiet beneath the starlight and realized that survival was not the end of the story. Rebuilding was. That night, as he settled on the porch steps with a mug of coffee in his hands, he told himself he'd never again underestimate the strength of neighbors working together. The storm had flattened their crops, but not their will. By early spring, the soil had dried enough to plow, though the deep grooves left by the storm still marked the western edge of the field. Samuel arrived at the Miller farm one frosty morning to find Mr. Miller already harnessing the team. Their breath clouded in the cool dawn as they prepared the ground for planting. The first furrows cut into the earth looked like scars across old skin, but to Samuel they also looked like promises. The land was ready to grow again. The plow's iron share sliced through the damp earth with a steady hiss, releasing the scent of rich soil long buried under winter frost. The children scattered wheat seed behind the plow, their laughter carrying faintly on the chilly breeze. Even the goats trotted behind them as if eager to see the field reborn. Samuel followed along, tamping the furrows gently with his boot to cover the seed. As the days lengthened, the field slowly transformed from rows of dark earth into a faint mist of green shoots. The wheat pushed upward, slender and stubborn, swaying lightly in the wind that once tried to flatten it. The neighbors often came by to lend a hand, hauling water from the well during dry spells, or mending the new fence rails that framed the pasture. Each visit brought a fresh loaf of bread or a basket of eggs, tokens of gratitude that carried more weight than gold in a farming town. One evening, while the sky still burned orange from sunset, Mr. Miller and Samuel stood by the pasture gate looking out at the tender blades of wheat. Mr. Miller's face, lined from years of sun and worry, softened as he said, "It'll be a fine field again, Samuel. We'll fill the bins yet." Samuel nodded, resting his forearms on the fence rail. Storm couldn't take the roots, it just tried to scare us out of planting. By midsummer, the wheat field stood shoulder high, rippling gold in the breeze. Walking through it was like wading through water turned to sunlight. The scars in the soil had disappeared beneath the thick stalks as though the land itself had healed. The Miller children ran between the rows chasing grasshoppers, their laughter mixing with the whisper of wheat heads brushing against each other. At dusk, the lanterns in the farmhouse windows glowed warm again, just as they had the night before the storm, a sign that life had reclaimed its rhythm. During the harvest that fall, Samuel helped guide the horse-drawn binder through the fields as the sun cast long stripes of light across the stubble. The steady clip of hooves and the rhythmic swish of the scythe against stalks created a music all their own. When the last wagon load was brought in and the bins stood full once more, the Millers hosted a small supper for the neighbors who had helped. They gathered under the barn's lantern-lit rafters, eating bread warm from the oven and sharing quiet stories of the storm that now felt like a memory from another lifetime. As the meal wound down, Mrs. Miller raised her cup of cider and said simply, "To the land that endures, and to the hands that stayed to see it through." The toast was met with soft murmurs of agreement, heads nodding around the table. Samuel felt a warmth in his chest that had little to do with the drink. He thought of that night in the cellar, the roar outside, and the promise he'd made to be ready next time. Looking around at the faces lit by lantern glow, he believed they all shared that same silent vow. That night, as Samuel left the Miller farm beneath a sky thick with stars, he glanced back at the golden stubble of the harvested field. The earth had kept its promise. So had the people. Winter settled over the plains with a soft hush, covering the fields in a quilt of frost. The wheat stubble that had glowed gold in autumn now lay hidden beneath a layer of white, and the winds that once roared in fury slid quietly through the frozen rows. Samuel returned often to the Miller farm that winter. Sometimes he brought a sack of coal from town. Other times he came simply to check the fences after a snowstorm. The cellar door where they had huddled during the tornado still bore a faint scar, a splintered edge where the iron bar had pressed hard during the storm's fury. Each time Samuel passed it, he brushed his glove over the wood as though greeting an old friend. The children had taken to sliding down the small hill behind the barn on makeshift sleds. Their laughter carried across the frosted field, a reminder that life had moved forward despite the season's hardships. In the evenings, lanterns glowed softly in the farmhouse windows, casting long orange rectangles onto the snowy yard. On one particularly cold afternoon, Samuel and Mr. Miller walked the length of the western fence line to check the posts for frost heave. The river that skirted the far side of the property had frozen solid, a silver ribbon winding through the white expanse. As they reached the edge of the wheat field, Mr. Miller stopped and looked across the land that had nearly been lost. "Funny thing about storms," he said, pulling his scarf tighter. "They leave scars you can't see until the snow melts." Samuel nodded. "But the land remembers, and so do we." When the first thaw came in early March, the water ran in narrow rivulets across the fields, darkening the soil where it seeped in. Samuel helped dig small trenches to guide the meltwater away from the barn foundation. The earth smelled rich and alive again, promising another season of planting. One evening, as dusk settled over the plain, Samuel found himself standing at the same fence post where he had listened to the fiddle the previous summer. The stars above were sharp and cold, the horizon still holding the last smear of daylight. He rested his hands on the rail, remembering the roar of the tornado and the prayers whispered in the cellar's dark. A horse's nicker behind him pulled him from his thoughts. The same horse that had stood tethered through the storm now stamped gently in the snow, its breath puffing in small white clouds. Samuel patted its neck and murmured thanks to the animal that had carried him to warn the neighbors that night. By mid-March, the Miller family began preparing the seed for the next planting. Samuel helped repair the seed drill, oiling the stiff gears and testing the wooden box for cracks. The promise of another wheat field stirred a quiet pride in them all. At the season's first Sunday supper after the thaw, neighbors gathered again around the Miller's long table. Bowls of stew steamed beside baskets of bread, and the conversation turned inevitably to the storm of the past summer. Each person recalled where they had been when the sky turned black, each voice carrying a thread of gratitude that the worst had spared them. Mrs. Miller said softly, "We were lucky that night, lucky to have been warned, lucky to have been together." Samuel didn't correct her. He knew it had been more than luck. It had been timing. A good horse, a strong cellar door, and the steady hands of neighbors willing to pull together. Later that night, as he left for home, Samuel looked back once more at the fields blanketed in snow and the faint lamplight spilling from the farmhouse windows. The land seemed to sleep beneath its white coverlet, gathering strength for the spring to come. He felt certain that when the wheat rose again, it would rise stronger than before, and the plains, quiet now under the moonlight, would hold the memory of that night's storm in their roots. By late spring, the fields had turned a rich green again, and the wheat swayed in waves that rolled like the prairie itself breathing. The scars of the tornado's path were now hidden beneath the new life, though Samuel knew the land remembered every uprooted fence post and splintered gate. One evening, after a long day repairing the last of the pasture rails, Samuel climbed the small ridge behind the Miller farmhouse to watch the sunset. The sky was painted in streaks of amber and rose, the clouds thin and peaceful. For the first time in months, he felt that the horizon looked gentle instead of threatening. The Miller boys joined him with a pair of tin cups filled with fresh well water. They sat together on the ridge, their boots digging into the grass as they looked out across the growing wheat field. The boys were quieter than usual, as if they too understood that this calm had been earned. Below them, the horse that had carried Samuel on the night of the storm grazed lazily near the fence, tail flicking against the evening flies. Samuel couldn't help but smile at the animal's steady presence. He knew that without that horse's speed, some of the neighbors might not have made it to the cellar in time. As dusk deepened, the first stars began to appear, bright and sharp in the wide prairie sky. Samuel thought about the cellar beneath them and the people who had gathered there, the prayers whispered into the dark as the wind roared above. Those memories no longer felt like shadows pressing in. They felt like proof that they had endured together. After a while, Mr. Miller came up the ridge carrying a lantern. Its soft glow lit the faces of his sons and flickered over Samuel's weathered hands resting on his knees. Mr. Miller said quietly, "We'll remember that night every time the wind changes. But tonight, the sky's ours again." Samuel nodded. The lantern's glow against the deepening twilight reminded him of that stormy night. The light that had guided frightened families into the cellar and now shone simply to mark the end of another workday. They stayed there until the last smear of orange faded from the horizon, and the lantern's glow became the brightest light on the ridge. Fireflies blinked in the grass around them, and the air was cool and clean, carrying only the soft rustle of wheat. As they returned to the farmhouse porch, the youngest Miller boy tugged at Samuel's sleeve. "Will the storm come back?" he asked. Samuel crouched to meet his eyes. "Storms always come back," he said gently, "but we'll always be ready for them. That's the difference." The boy nodded solemnly as though the answer had been enough to settle something deep inside him. Later that night, long after the lamps in the farmhouse windows went dark, Samuel stepped outside once more. The moon had risen high, casting a silver glow over the plains. The wheat field looked like a living ocean under the pale light, each blade catching the moon's touch. He thought of all the nights he had lain awake wondering if the land could ever feel safe again. And now, with the calm sky stretched above, he felt a quiet gratitude that words couldn't quite hold. The night that had once been filled with roaring wind now belonged to the whispering wheat and the endless star. Samuel took one last look at the fields before heading back inside, carrying with him the unspoken promise that he would never forget what it had taken to reach this peace. Years later, whenever Samuel spoke of that night, he never began with the roar of the storm or the darkness of the cellar. He always began with the field, the wheat that rose again after being crushed. To him, that was the true story, not destruction, but what came after. By the summer following the tornado, the plains glowed gold once more. The wheat rose thick and strong, heads bending heavy in the wind as if the land itself had decided to prove it could not be broken. The scars of the storm's path had vanished beneath the rolling waves of grain. On the day of harvest, neighbors gathered again, just as they had the year before, but this time their faces carried pride instead of worry. The horse-drawn binders moved steadily across the field, cutting swaths through the grain while wagons filled high with sheaves. Samuel worked shoulder to shoulder with Mr. Miller and the others, sweat streaking his face, muscles aching, but his spirit buoyed by the sight of abundance. When the last load was hauled to the barn, the bins were full, brimming with enough to feed families and animals through the winter and still have seed for planting. The farmhouse porch became the stage for a feast that night. Lanterns hung from the rafters, their light shining across tables piled with bread, stews, and cider. The children played in the yard while the adults shared stories of storms and survival, laughter mixing with the hum of crickets. At one point, Mrs. Miller raised her glass and said simply, "To the wheat that stood against the wind." The words settled into the air like a prayer, and everyone echoed the toast. Samuel felt his chest tighten with pride, knowing he had been part of something larger than himself. Later, when the lanterns were dimmed and the neighbors headed home, Samuel walked alone to the edge of the field. The moon rose high, bathing the wheat in silver light. He reached out and let the stalks brush against his hand, their heads heavy with grain. He thought of the cellar, the frightened children, the goats bleating in the dark, the prayers whispered over the roar. He thought of the horse standing firm outside, waiting. He thought of the flattened field the morning after and the promise he had made to never be caught unprepared again. The storm had left its mark, yes, but it had also carved something deeper into Samuel. The knowledge that fear can be endured, that neighbors can become a shield, and that even when the wind seems stronger than stone, life has a way of pushing through the cracks. He tipped his hat toward the sky, where the stars gleamed bright and endless. "You tried," he murmured to the night, "but we're still here." When Samuel finally left the farm, the image of that golden field under the moon stayed with him. It would be the story he carried forward, the one he'd tell to children and grandchildren long after the details of the storm blurred with time. Because the lesson wasn't about fear, but about what rises after it. And so the wheatfield lived on, not only in the soil of the plains, but in the memory of those who had stood together, sheltered one another, and planted again. If this story moved you, share it with someone who has faced their own storm. And if you've ever stood against the wind yourself, leave a comment. I'd like to know what you carried back when the sky finally cleared.